Hello National 5 historians, and welcome to the next lesson in our Nazi Germany topic. This lesson is looking at opposition to the Nazis. In particular, what you need to be able to do by the end of this lesson is two things. You need to be able to describe the different groups that opposed Nazi rule in Germany, and you need to be able to explain why this resistance or opposition to Nazi rule ultimately wasn't successful. So why didn't it actually work out, and why did Nazi rule continue? So wherever you're doing your notes, use this as a heading and continue the lesson. So before we talk about the groups that opposed Hitler, it's probably a good idea to just recap really quickly the groups that supported him. And a really nice way to do this is using this mnemonic to help you. Oi, you are a wicked fascist. O-I, U-R-A-W-F. This stands for the people that supported Hitler and the Nazis. So we've got ordinary Germans, industrialists, those with the money, the unemployed, we've got the rich, we've got the army, the workers and the farmers. These are the kind of main people who were supporting Hitler and the Nazis as they took power and they started to consolidate it. So we're talking about the others, the ones that didn't actually support them, for opposition groups. So although the Nazis had control of Germany from 1933, when Hitler was made Chancellor, up until 1945, there actually were some people who were involved in actions to try and oppose and resist the Nazi government. There were very many different groups involved in opposing Nazi rule in Germany, and we're going to look at these in a little bit more detail. So who opposed Hitler? We've got another mnemonic thing for you here. You must oppose crazy politicians. And this stands for youth groups, military, ordinary Germans, churches and political groups. And this is what we're going to look at in a little bit more detail in this lesson. In order to do this, we're going to use the next set of slides to build a set of tables for each of the opposition groups in our mnemonic. What you'll need to do is make a copy of the table, read the information for each group on the following slides, and summarise that information into your own words in each section of the table so that you have a completed section overall. So this is what the first one's going to look like, and I've filled in the first stage for you, so you can just copy that like that. So we've got the opposition group, who they are amongst this kind of group on our mnemonic. So these are the youth groups, and these are the ones that we're going to talk about. We've got reasons for the opposition against the Nazis, so why they're doing it, what methods they used, and what impact their opposition had on the regime. So what actually happened to them, or what impact did they have. So I've done the first one, the White Rose group, for you, and you are going to use the information to fill in the rest. So pause this video, make a copy of the table in your jotter, and use the next couple of slides to fill it in when you're ready. So the White Rose group, even though we filled this in just to kind of take you through this in a wee bit more detail, was set up by Hans and Sophie Scholl and Professor Kurt Huber at Munich University in 1941. They hated the brutal treatment and repression of the different groups within society. They urged Germans to get rid of Hitler and called for a campaign of passive resistance against the Nazi regime, and they distributed pamphlets to make people aware of the Nazi atrocities, what was actually happening. They painted anti-Nazi slogans on the walls, and on the 18th of February 1943 the leaders were arrested by the Gestapo for distributing leaflets, and they were tortured and executed. There's a video clip here from BBC Magazine, BBC News, which talks about the White Rose group and the people that were involved in this. If you want to click it, you can see it in the team and on our playlist, and you'll be able to have a look at that in a wee bit more detail. So the other groups that you're looking to summarise. The Edelweiss Pirates. This group really objected to the way the Nazis attempted to control the lives, that should be, of young people. They wore check shirts, dark trousers, and their emblem was the Edelweiss flower. They beat up members of the Hitler Youth. They pushed propaganda leaflets dropped by the Allied planes through letterboxes. They sheltered deserters from the armed forces. One particular 16-year-old leader of the Cologne Pirates, who was a kind of a splinter group from them, together with 12 other members of this group, were hanged by the Gestapo in November 1944 for their actions. The other group is the Swing Group. Members of the Swing Youth tended to be middle class. They rejected the ideals of the Hitler Youth and developed a rival culture. Swing clubs were established in bars, nightclubs and houses in cities such as Hamburg, Berlin, Frankfurt, Dresden. They listened to British and American music, especially jazz, which was banned by the Nazis. The girls would wear makeup, which was frowned upon, and they accepted Jews into their group. Again, a big no-no as far as this was concerned. So you're going to summarise into your table the key points about each of the groups and then move on to the next table. So this one is the military. So again, you're going to just draw out the table exactly the same way you did before, but with military instead of youth groups here. And these are the ones that you're looking for in a wee bit more detail. So remember, you're looking for reasons for opposition, what they did, and what impact their opposition actually had on the Nazi regime. So the first one, the Chrysalis Circle. As Hitler could not be voted out, many felt that the best way to eradicate the Nazis was to assassinate Hitler. There were over 50 attempts on Hitler's life. The most famous was on the 20th of July 1944, where a bomb was set off at Hitler's Wolf Lair headquarters, but it failed. One organised group was this particular group, the Chrysalis Circle, which consisted of army officers, university professors and aristocrats who hated Hitler's brutality and plans for war. They met regularly and discussed the assassination, but they didn't actually do anything because they were fearful of repercussions of their actions, so ultimately they failed. Klaus von Stauffenberg, however, in July 1944, Klaus von Stauffenberg, who was an army officer who hated Hitler's lies about the victory in war, led a group that planned to detonate a bomb when Hitler was meeting other Nazi leaders. They would then take over, end the war, and change Germany for the better. The bomb killed 4 men, burnt Hitler's hair, burst his eardrums and blew some of his clothes off, but didn't ultimately kill him. It also made Hitler suspicious of every general staff officer he came across, which ultimately meant he was actually not really particularly open to other military people having attempts in future. So pause it here, see if you can summarise some key bits of information into the table about these two groups, and then move on to the next bit for the next two. General Ludwig Beck. Many senior military figures did begin to worry about Hitler's power, especially in the early days, with his foreign policies seeming likely to cause war. Crisis in Czechoslovakia in the 1930s brought these issues to a head. A lot of the generals opposed this conflict, especially the Army Chief of Staff, General Ludwig Beck. He spoke at a meeting of army generals against the plans to invade Czechoslovakia and was forced to resign by Hitler. He then worked with a group of senior military figures to form a coup to remove Hitler from power, but this ultimately never happened. It just fell apart and he never actually managed to succeed. The Abwehr was a German military intelligence organisation. It was involved in quite a lot of anti-Nazi activities. They were led by Admiral Wilhelm Karnies, who was opposed to Hitler's persecution of religious groups. He thought the Nazis were gangsters, and he was believed to have given secrets to the UK and the US spies, also helping Jewish people leave Germany using fake papers claiming they were agents. He was ultimately executed in 1945 for what he did. So the next group, we have ordinary people and just general ordinary workers for ordinary Germans. So again, make a copy of the table for this group and use the next section to fill in some detail. As far as ordinary people go, some Germans publicly showed that they didn't support the Nazis by refusing to do exactly as they were told. This involved not giving Hitler the salute or giving money to the Hitler Youth, refusing to obviously give that, who collected money for things like their winter funds. The lowest type of opposition was just moaning or grumbling in their own homes, telling anti-Nazi jokes, complaining about the way that their Jewish friends were treated. People were really always frightened that their friends or neighbours would report them to the Gestapo, however, so ultimately it didn't really go much further than just quiet grumblings. As far as the working class people were concerned, most members of the working class in Germany did not vote for the Nazis. The workers opposed Nazism in different ways. Sometimes this was linked to the communist groups, which we'll talk about in a minute. They engaged in strikes and go-slows in armament factories. They also protested food prices. One of the most famous examples of this resistance was from August Landsmaser. Maser had been a Nazi, but he'd left the party after marrying a Jew, and he famously refused to give a Nazi salute at his workplace rally in 1936, and he was arrested for this. You can see him there, circled just here. All of the other people giving the salute and him refusing to do it, and this was his way of opposing. Ultimately, it led to his arrest. Okay, churches then, quite a few for this one, 4 for this one. Again, copy the table and use the next couple of slides to fill it in. So the Catholic Church, the churches were an issue Hitler was very worried about. He wanted to control their actions, but he worried that the German people would be angry if he did this, so instead he tried to reach a deal, which we talked about previously, which was called the Concordat with the Catholic Church. This said, if the Catholic Church stayed out of politics, the Nazis would leave them alone. However, they broke this agreement and arrested many priests on made-up charges and tried to remove crucifixes from Catholic classrooms. So in 1937, Pope Pius issued a document called With Burning Grief, which was a public attack on Nazism. Many German Catholics spoke out against Nazi policies such as euthanasia and their policies on the mentally and physically handicapped as well, and they spoke out against that and were punished accordingly for it. In terms of the confessional church, one of the other opinions for Hitler was basically to introduce his own church, the Reich Church, and this led to the creation, kind of as a retaliation, of the confessional church by German Protestants to try and stop the Nazi party creating a kind of Protestant church of their own, a Nazified version of it. One of the founders of this, Martin Niemöller, had initially supported Hitler but later did come out to oppose him. He was sent with some others to concentration camps. As well as keeping Nazism away from all parts of the Protestant church, the confessional church also publicly opposed Nazism, including sending letters to Hitler criticising his actions, criticising things like anti-Semitism, and the Nazis in turn confiscated the church's funding as a result of that and sent some of the other people, pastors in it, to concentration camps as a result. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Nazi opponent, member of the confessional church, who trained pastors and encouraged them to criticise Nazism and all of Hitler's policies quite openly. He was banned from preaching and he later died in a concentration camp for his actions. Jehovah's Witnesses as well, they refused to perform the Hitler salute or they stopped their children joining the Hitler youth groups. They also refused to be conscripted into the German army as well. Quite a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses were arrested or fired from their jobs as a result of this, and some of them ended up in concentration camps as well. So the last one for this is the opposition groups and methods of political groups, and we've got the Communist Party, the KPD and the SPD for this one. So the Communist Party also worked against Nazi rule. This included acts of sabotage, spying by giving information to the USSR. They also distributed various anti-Nazi materials. Following the Reichstag fire, more than 30,000 KPD members continued with underground resistance because it wasn't safe to do anything else, and many members were arrested and killed or sent to concentration camps as a result. The SPD, on the other side, their members went underground and formed resistance groups called the Red Strike Troops. By late 1933, this group had around 3,000 members. They tried to cause as much trouble as they could politically for the Nazis, but ultimately their members were arrested and it failed as well. Now, obviously we know that Hitler had spent quite a lot of time dealing with opposition before these groups really were involved. For external opposition, what he'd already done was banning political parties and trade unions. Remember, with the Reichstag Fire Act and the Enabling Act, officials being arrested and jailed. He used terror and fear in a kind of police state to try and ensure nobody would oppose him. And he dealt with internal opposition, so opposition within the Nazi Party itself, with the Night of the Long Knives. So we knew that this meant that Hitler was willing to deal with opposition very brutally if it was necessary. And this is kind of one of the reasons why opposition groups didn't really succeed particularly well in Nazi Germany. So the next few slides have a copy of a summary mind map looking at why opposition failed. There is also a PDF copy of this. We're going to read over the slides and then what I want you to do is download the completed mind map and use it to answer these two questions, which is describe the difficulties that were faced by opposition groups in Nazi Germany and explain why opposition was difficult in Nazi Germany. And these are going to be your assignment questions for this lesson. So, a couple of reasons why it was difficult, fear being the main one. Most Germans were too scared to protest because of the risk of being arrested and tortured by the SS, so they didn't, they stayed quiet. They also didn't know who they could trust because of the Gestapo informers, so they didn't express any negative views out with their homes. Many Germans did inform on opposition groups to the Gestapo and SS, so they had really good prior experience of this happening, so they were very quiet when they needed to be. In terms of support, some Germans actually did support the Nazis and believed in Hitler's policies. They believed that this was improving life in Germany and they wanted this to continue. Unemployment did fall hugely and the military had been rebuilt, which won support after the whole Treaty of Versailles thing. So it was very difficult to oppose the Nazis if you couldn't get members, because a lot of people did actually support them. Censorship was also very difficult. Due to the Reichstag Fire Decree, censorship made it harder for anti-Nazi messages to be heard because they couldn't publish them, which stopped opposition gaining support, again meaning there wasn't an awful lot of people involved. Execution was a really mass deterrent in extreme cases. The Nazis executed opposition leaders. Removing these leaders made it really hard to organise anti-Nazi groups and scared other people from being members because they didn't want to be executed as well. Opposition groups that did exist were generally quite disorganised, and political opposition groups refused to work together quite often, so the SPD and the KPD, for example. As a result of this, groups had to meet in secret, which meant they were fairly disorganised in getting the meetings and they couldn't have them consistently to plan anything. Youth groups like the Edelweiss Pirates were also really disorganised and didn't have an awful lot of people involved. Quite a lot of the communist and socialist leaders had fled Germany. The others were arrested or killed or sent to the concentration camps, so there was not actually a really clear leadership who would organise everything and get people moving. In terms of the youth, overall the youth groups were weak because they were only a very small minority and a lot of them had been arrested and hanged, which put other people off becoming involved in them. In terms of the churches, the Nazis did take steps to try and limit the church opposition, such as the Concordat with the Catholic Church and setting up the Reich Church as an alternative to the Protestant groups. Most church groups agreed to cooperate with the Nazis, so there was not a lot of opposition there, and the Concordat between Rome and the Nazis actually worked fairly well initially. It wasn't until later that that started to break down. In terms of the army issues, the army had sworn an oath of loyalty to Hitler following Hindenburg's death, and the army oath is sacred to most soldiers, so there's quite a significant reluctance to stand up to the Nazis and oppose them. Hitler also used the bomb attacks as an excuse to round up all known opponents in the army, and about 5,000 were arrested and executed, and this act was a deterrent for any further opposition from within the military forces. Banning trade unions and political parties also stopped opposition getting together and made it more difficult for groups to get organised. Propaganda was huge, and it created the impression that Hitler was universally popular, which meant it was quite difficult to find supporters. And the concentration camps themselves are probably one of the biggest ones. Germans are scared of being sent to one of these. Conditions were horrible. Inmates had to do hard labour and were given little food, so it was really an awful place to be. 1933 alone, there are 100,000 political opponents in these camps, and it gets worse as things go on. And it has been proven that outspoken individuals like Martin Nielomer, for example, would be sent to these concentration camps as punishment for opposition, and this really put people off. So now that we've gone through this in a wee bit more detail, you can get the completed version of the mind map, which you can see a little bit better, and use it to answer these inquiry skills questions and upload them to the team. Any questions or anything you're not sure about, email, put a message in your team, or ask your teacher and let us know how you're getting on.